She signed a marriage contract to a crime lord to save her family. She expected a cage. She got something far more dangerous, a man she couldn't stop watching. And someone inside his empire wanted her dead before she figured out why. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me until the very end, because nothing about this is what it looks like. The estate looked like it was grieving. Serena Holloway noticed that the moment she stepped out of the car and stood in the driveway of the house where she'd grown up, the wraparound porch sagging on its left side, two shutters hanging crooked above the east windows, the fountain in the center of the motor court bone dry and full of dead leaves. The grounds crew had stopped coming 6 weeks ago. She'd let them go herself, the same week the lawyers started calling with news she didn't want to hear and couldn't afford to ignore. The Holloway estate had always been impressive from the road. 2 acres of manicured grounds behind an iron gate, a colonial-style manor with 12 rooms and a wine cellar that went back 4 generations. Her father had been proud of this house the way men of a certain era were proud of things, not with warmth, but with possession. The way you'd be proud of a watch or a trophy or a vault. Now it just looked tired. Serena pulled her coat tighter and told herself the chill was from the October wind coming off the ridge. She was 31 years old, a structural engineer by training, practical by nature, and not given to superstition. She didn't believe in omens or bad luck, or the idea that houses could absorb the emotional states of the people inside them. But standing there in the driveway at 6:40 in the morning, 3 days after burying her father, with a manila envelope full of documents she still hadn't fully processed tucked under her arm, she understood for the first time in her life why people talked about places feeling haunted. She went inside. Her mother was already up, which meant she hadn't slept. Eleanor Holloway sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from, her silver hair pinned back with the careful precision of a woman who believed that grooming was the last line of defense against falling apart entirely. She was 63 years old and had spent 40 of those years being the wife of a man who turned out to be someone else entirely. "You're back early," Eleanor said. "Drove through the night." Serena set the envelope on the table between them. "I need you to read this." Her mother looked at the envelope the way you'd look at something that had already bitten you once. "The lawyers called again while you were gone." "I know. That's what's in there." "Serena, Mom." She pulled out the chair across from her mother and sat down. Her back ached from 10 hours behind the wheel. Her eyes felt like they'd been sandpapered. She didn't have the patience or the energy for softness right now, and she was aware that was cruel but couldn't seem to fix it. "Please, just read it." Eleanor set down the mug. She picked up the envelope. She opened it slowly, the way people open things when they already know the contents are going to be bad, and spent the next 7 minutes reading in silence while Serena watched the light change through the kitchen window and thought about her father. Thomas Holloway had built his construction empire from a single paving contract in 1987. That was the story he'd told at every dinner party, every industry event, every family holiday since Serena could remember. The story of a man who'd started with nothing but a second-hand backhoe and an appetite for work and had turned it into something real. He'd been proud of that story. He told it the way other men told war stories, with relish, with detail, with the self-satisfaction of someone who believed he'd earned the right to be exactly who he was. He'd died of a heart attack in his study on a Tuesday morning. He was 68 years old. The doctors said it was fast. They said he probably didn't feel much. 3 days later, his lawyers had called Serena, not her mother, not her younger brother Daniel, but Serena, and asked her to come in for an emergency meeting. She'd assumed it was about the will. It wasn't about the will. Eleanor put the papers down. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She just sat there with her hands flat on the table and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and Serena watched her mother's face do something she had never seen it do before. Not at the funeral, not when the doctors had called with the news, not even during those terrible weeks when her father's financial situation had first started unraveling. Eleanor Holloway's composure cracked. Not dramatically, not in tears, just a fracture. A hairline break across the surface of a face that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will for 36 hours. "He knew," Eleanor said finally. Her voice was very quiet. "Yes." For how long? The lawyers think at least 12 years, probably longer. Eleanor closed her eyes. The Belmont contracts. Serena looked at her. You knew about those? I knew they weren't right. Her mother opened her eyes. They were dry and very steady, and somehow that was worse than tears would have been. I asked him once. He told me it was complicated and that I should trust him. The Belmont contracts were construction projects, highway infrastructure, drainage systems, a pair of industrial warehouses on the edge of the state. Standard work, on paper. But according to the documents Serena's lawyers had spent 3 days assembling, the money flowing through those contracts had never been about concrete and rebar. It had been about movement. Cash moving through corporate shells, cleaned through labor invoices that didn't correspond to any actual work, re-emerged on the other end as legitimate business income. Thomas Holloway's construction empire had been a laundry, and the money being laundered belonged to the Moretti family. Serena had grown up in this state. She'd heard the name. Everyone had heard the name, in the same casual, don't look directly at it way you heard about certain things. The way people in coastal towns knew about rip currents. You didn't have to understand exactly how it worked to know that getting caught in one would kill you. $52 million, Serena said. That's what the lawyers are saying he moved over the past decade and a half. Most of it's gone. Bad investments, expenses, a real estate development that collapsed in 2019. She stopped. There's nothing left. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. What does this mean for us? Before Serena could answer, the sound of tires on gravel came through the window. She turned. Through the kitchen window, she could see the driveway, and the driveway was filling with vehicles. 4 of them, black SUVs with tinted windows, moving in a slow, deliberate convoy through the estate's main gate. The gate she had definitely locked behind her when she'd come in 20 minutes ago. Her stomach dropped. Mom, she stood up. Go upstairs. Take Daniel and go to his room and lock the door. Serena, what? Please. She was already moving toward the hallway. Right now. Don't come down until I tell you. She heard her mother's chair scrape back. She heard footsteps on the stairs. She was already at the front window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see. The SUVs had stopped in the motor court. Men were getting out, 8 of them that she could count, in dark coats, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who knew they were not going to be challenged. They took up positions around the perimeter of the property with the casual, practiced quality of people doing a job they'd done before. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just present. One of the vehicle's back doors opened last. The man who stepped out was not what she expected, and she wasn't sure what she'd expected exactly. Someone louder, maybe. Bigger. Something that matched the name. Lucien Moretti was about 40, lean and dark-haired, dressed in a coat that cost more than most people's cars. He stood in her dead father's driveway and looked at the house with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. Not contempt, not hunger, not the predatory interest she'd braced for. He looked almost measured, careful, like a man arriving at a meeting he'd been thinking about for a long time. He knocked on the front door. Serena stood in the hallway for 3 full seconds and told herself she was not afraid. Then she told herself she was afraid, and that was fine, and she should open the door anyway. She opened the door. Lucien Moretti looked at her. Up close he had dark eyes. Not warm, not cold exactly, but very still. The kind of eyes that had learned not to broadcast anything. Miss Holloway. His voice was even, measured. A slight accent she couldn't immediately place, smoothed down by years of somewhere else. I apologize for the hour. I thought it would be better to speak before you had visitors from other parties. What other parties? She said. The kind that don't knock. He held her gaze. May I come in? She should have said no. Every rational instinct she had told her to say no and call the police and lock the door and let whatever was going to happen, happen. She was aware of the 8 men arranged behind him on her property. She was aware of the weight of the documents still sitting on her kitchen table. She was aware that the kind of trouble her father had walked into was not the kind that went away when you refused to answer the door. She stepped back. He came inside. 2 of his men followed. one positioning himself near the front door, one moving quietly toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. Neither of them looked at her. They moved like furniture, or like architecture, like fixtures she wasn't supposed to notice. Lucian stopped in the entrance hall and looked around the space with the same careful, measuring expression he'd worn outside. She watched him take in the water stain on the ceiling where the roof had leaked 2 winters ago and hadn't been properly repaired, the bare patch on the hardwood where a rug had been sold 3 months back, the general accumulation of small, visible financial stress that she'd been too proud and too exhausted to try to hide. "The kitchen," she said flatly. "If we're going to do this." He followed her. He sat down at her kitchen table without being invited and placed a slim leather portfolio on the surface between them. He didn't open it immediately. "You know who I am," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Then you understand why I'm here." "I have some guesses." She sat down across from him and kept her hands flat on the table, the way her mother had, because it was something to do with them. "My father laundered money for your organization. He's dead. The money is gone. You're here to collect." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like adjustment, like someone recalibrating. "Your father moved approximately $52 million through his construction business over the past 14 years, Lucian said. Of that total, approximately $47 million passed through clean and was accounted for in the normal course of business arrangements. The remaining $5 million was not." He paused. "The debt your family owes is the full 52. "That's not how math works," Serena said. "That's how contracts work." She looked at him steadily. "We don't have $52 million. We don't have $5 million. We don't have—" She stopped. "You know exactly what we have. I assume you've seen the financial records." "I have." "Then you know there's nothing to collect." Lucian opened the portfolio. He placed a single document on the table between them. It was 4 pages, dense with legal language she recognized as professionally drafted, and at the bottom there was a signature line with her name printed beneath it in clean, even type. She looked at the document. She looked at him. "A marriage contract," she said. "Yes." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a crow landed on the dead fountain and made a sound like something tearing. "You're insane," she said. "I've been called worse." He said it without heat, without defensiveness. Just fact. "The proposal is simple. You become my legal wife. The debt disappears entirely. All 52 million, canceled. Your mother retains the estate. Your brother finishes his education without interruption. No other members of your family are approached for repayment." He was watching her with those very still eyes. "The alternative is that other interested parties become aware of your father's records and begin their own collection efforts. Those parties are less patient than I am and considerably less—" A brief pause. "Procedural." Serena stared at the contract. She'd been a structural engineer for 8 years. She'd spent those 8 years looking at things, bridges, foundations, buildings, and identifying precisely where they were likely to fail. She was good at it. She had a particular talent for seeing load-bearing points, for understanding which elements were holding up the weight and which ones were decorative. Looking at the contract on her kitchen table, she understood with cold clarity exactly what load was being transferred here and onto whom. "How long?" she said. "That would be discussed." "Discussed by who?" Her voice stayed even. She was proud of that. "You'd have legal authority over those discussions." "The contract includes protections," Lucian said. "You would have legal counsel of your own choosing review the terms. You would retain personal financial independence. You would not be—" Another of those brief, careful pauses. "Required to perform any role beyond the legal status itself." "I need to understand what that means." He met her eyes. "It means what I said." The silence stretched. Serena thought about Daniel. He was 23, finishing a master's degree, and had no idea, none, she was almost certain, what their father had actually been. He'd adored the man, still did, in the stunned, uncomprehending way of someone whose grief hadn't yet begun to metabolize the new information layered beneath it. If collection agents, criminal collection agents, the kind Lucien was describing, came for Daniel, it would not go the same way as a conversation at a kitchen table. She thought about her mother's face doing that thing it had done an hour ago. The hairline fracture, The years of quiet suspicion confirmed into something unspeakable. She thought about the 8 men arranged around her father's property and the fact that Lucien had set other parties as though they were already waiting for a signal. She picked up the pen from the portfolio. "I want my own lawyer," she said. "Not someone you recommend. Mine." "Agreed. I want a specific clause guaranteeing my mother and brother's safety isn't contingent on my continued compliance with whatever you're about to call this arrangement." "Also agreed. And I want 72 hours before I sign this." A beat. "You have 48. She put the pen down. "Not signing yet, just placing it." "Get out of my kitchen." He stood. He left the portfolio on the table. He buttoned his coat with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd gotten what he came for, or close enough to it, and he walked back toward the front door with the same unhurried quality he'd arrived with. At the hallway, he stopped. He didn't turn around. "Your father," he said. "He wasn't a good man, Miss Holloway, but there was one thing he did years ago that was correct." A pause. "I won't forget it." Then he left. The door closed. The SUVs reversed out of the driveway in the same careful convoy formation, and within 4 minutes the estate was empty again. Just the dead fountain and the listing porch and the crow that had already flown away. Serena sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She read the contract 3 times. Her lawyer, her actual lawyer, a woman named Priya who'd handled her aunt's estate and had no connection to any of this, arrived at noon, read the document twice, said several things in a controlled voice that amounted to, "This is not a situation I can recommend," and then helped Serena identify the specific clauses that needed changes. Lucian's people responded to every amendment within 2 hours. Most of them were accepted. One was negotiated. None were refused outright. Which told her something. She wasn't sure what yet, but it was something. She signed the contract 36 hours later at 2 in the morning, alone at the kitchen table after her mother had gone to bed. She used her full name, Serena Margaret Holloway. The signature was clean and steady and looked nothing like how she felt. The next morning, a car arrived to take her to the Moretti estate. She'd expected a fortress, thick walls, guards at every corner. The architecture of confinement made literal in stone. She'd spent 36 hours preparing herself psychologically for a particular kind of place, a place designed to communicate power by making you feel small inside it. The Moretti estate was none of those things. It was large, genuinely large, a converted historic property set on 40 acres of rolling land outside the city, with a gate that was heavy iron but not prison iron, and grounds that were more cultivated than manicured. The main house was 3 stories of dark stone and tall windows, and it looked less like a fortress than like a house that had been taken seriously for a very long time. The woman who met her at the door was in her mid-40s, brisk and compact, and introduced herself as Mrs. Farrow, the house manager. She showed Serena to a suite on the 2nd floor. 3 rooms, a private bathroom, tall windows overlooking the east garden, and explained, without particular warmth but also without hostility, that the household operated on certain schedules, and that Serena was welcome to use any common areas of the house, but that the west wing was restricted. "Restricted how?" Serena asked. "Mr. Moretti's private offices," Mrs. Farrow said. "You'll be told if that changes." She left. Serena stood in the center of the suite and looked at the furniture and the windows and the bookshelf stocked with what appeared to be a thoughtful selection of novels and nonfiction she hadn't requested, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Confusion. There were no bars, no lock on her door. She checked. No guards stationed outside it. When she walked downstairs an hour later and out through the side entrance into the east garden, no one stopped her or followed her. She walked the perimeter of the garden, then a path that took her along the edge of the property's eastern fence line. And while she was aware of security cameras mounted at intervals and aware of the distant figures of security personnel she could occasionally see near the main gate, no one approached her or redirected her or told her she'd gone far enough. She had been brought here as a debt payment, and they were letting her walk around outside. She came back inside through the side entrance and nearly walked directly into Lucien Moretti, who was coming the other direction through the corridor with a phone to his ear. He stopped. She stopped. He said something brief and quiet into the phone and ended the call. "You found the garden," he said. "I found the entire eastern fence line," she said. "I was testing." Something that might have been amusement moved across his face and vanished. And nothing stopped me. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you're not a prisoner." He said it simply, without performance. "I signed a contract that says I'm your wife." "Yes." He didn't look away. "Those are two different things." He moved past her into the corridor and was gone before she could decide what to say to that. She stood in the empty hallway and felt the confusion settle deeper, changing shape, becoming something else, something more uncomfortable than she'd expected. Because the thing about a cage was that you understood what it wanted from you. She didn't understand what this was. Dinner that first night was served in a smaller dining room off the main kitchen, not the formal space she'd assumed she'd be made to perform in. Just a table, 4 chairs, food that was good without being theatrical. Lucian sat at one end and read something on a tablet while she ate, and they did not speak, which she was grateful for, and when it was over he said, "Good night, Miss Holloway," and left. She went back to her suite and lay on top of the covers with her coat on and stared at the ceiling. Over the next 4 days, she established what she would later think of as the absurd rhythms of that first week. She got up early. She walked the grounds. She ate meals, sometimes with Lucien at that small table, sometimes alone in her room. She called her mother twice a day. She called Priya and asked her to start compiling information about the Moretti organization's legitimate business holdings. Because if she was going to be inside this thing, she was going to understand its structure. That was just how she worked. She looked at the load-bearing points. Lucien never entered her suite uninvited. He never touched her. When they occupied the same room, which happened occasionally, a morning when they both arrived in the library at the same time, an afternoon when she came in from the garden to find him at the kitchen table with papers spread across it, he treated her with a precise, considered courtesy that she found more difficult to process than rudeness would have been. Rudeness she knew how to meet. This she didn't know what to do with. On the 5th night, she was woken at 2 a.m. by the sound of breaking glass. Her room was dark. She was on her feet before she fully understood why, some animal reflex pulling her upright, and then she was hearing footsteps. Not slow, but fast, running footsteps from somewhere below, and then something that was absolutely definitely the sound of someone moving very quickly through the hallway outside her door. She didn't scream. That was instinct also. She'd grown up in a house where noise meant vulnerability. She moved to the corner of the room near the window, because that was away from the door, and she found the lamp on the nightstand by feel and held it, which was not a weapon exactly, but was something. The door opened. It was one of Lucien's men. She'd seen him before, a large man with a shaved head who stationed himself near the front entrance in the evenings. He swept the room with a flashlight, registered her position, and said, "Stay here," in a voice that expected to be obeyed. Then he was gone. She stayed. For 20 minutes, she stood in the corner of her room with the lamp in her hand and listened to the sounds of the house. Footsteps, a door, voices too low to make out words, and then gradually, slowly, a return to quiet. Lucien appeared in the doorway. He was still dressed, which meant he hadn't been sleeping, which she filed away without knowing why. He looked at her in the corner with the lamp. "You can put that down," he said. "I haven't decided yet." She looked at him. Her heartbeat was still high. What happened? He was quiet for a moment, not the evasive quiet of someone choosing a lie, but the measured quiet of someone deciding how much truth to give. Someone entered the property. They've been removed. Removed? No one was hurt. She set the lamp down. Who? Someone looking for something they believed you had. He met her eyes. You're safe. I was under the impression, Serena said, that being here was supposed to make me safe. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly. Something adjacent to it. I'm aware of the irony. She looked at him standing in the doorway of the room she hadn't been allowed to lock, in the house she hadn't been able to leave. On the night someone had broken in to reach her, and she thought, I have made a catastrophic error in understanding what I signed. Lucien. It was the first time she'd used his name. He registered it. She saw that. If someone is trying to kill me, I have a right to know why. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said finally. You do. He didn't tell her that night. He told her to sleep, which she didn't, and he posted 2 men outside her door. And in the morning, when she came downstairs, he was waiting in the library with coffee already poured and an expression on his face that told her the conversation they were about to have was one he'd been preparing for. She sat down across from him. There's a ledger, he said. She looked at him, waited. Your father kept records, detailed records, of every transaction he processed, not just the financial data, names, dates, evidence connecting specific individuals to specific criminal and financial activities. His voice was careful and even. Those records were never found. Certain people believe you know where they are. I don't, she said. I know. He held her gaze. But they don't. And until they're convinced of that, he stopped. Until they're convinced, she said, they'll keep sending people. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Serena looked at her coffee. She looked at the room around her, the books, the morning light through the tall windows, the carefully maintained order of a house that had learned to hold itself together under pressure. She looked at the man across the table who had married her for a reason he still hadn't fully explained, who had armed men outside her door, who treated her with a precision that felt less like coldness and more like control. Like someone managing something carefully because they were afraid of what happened if they didn't. There's something else, she said. Isn't there? He was quiet. You said my father did something. That night you came to the house. One thing that was correct. She watched his face. That wasn't about the ledger. Lucien set down his coffee cup. For a moment, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't the controlled stillness she'd come to expect. Something older and less managed. No, he said. That wasn't about the ledger. He didn't say what it was about. And somehow, in the way he looked away after, out toward the window, toward the grounds, toward something she couldn't see, that was the most unsettling thing that had happened since the night a stranger had broken through the glass trying to reach her. Because whatever her father had done, it mattered to Lucien Moretti in a way that had nothing to do with money, and she had no idea what that meant. Yet. Zermmet. She had signed the contract to survive. She had entered the house expecting a prison. Now someone inside Lucien's own empire was sending killers through the windows, and the man she'd married to escape danger was the only thing standing between her and whatever her father had left behind. The question that was going to keep her awake every night from here forward wasn't whether she could trust him. It was why trusting him already felt less impossible than it should. 3 days after the broken window, Serena moved her mattress. Not to another room, just away from the wall adjacent to the hallway, dragged it 6 feet toward the center of the room at 2 a.m. while the house was quiet. Because she'd spent 72 hours lying in that bed listening to every sound the corridor made, and she needed, at minimum, to not feel like whatever came through the door next time would reach her before she could get upright. It was a small thing, probably irrational. She did it anyway. She was a structural engineer. She understood load distribution. She understood that where something sat in relation to a potential point of failure was not nothing, that positioning mattered, that 6 feet of additional response time was 6 feet of additional response time regardless of what you were responding to. She told herself this and finished moving the mattress and went back to sleep, or tried to, and lay on her back in the center of the dark room and listened to the house breathe around her. The Moretti estate had its own particular sound at night. The heating system moved through the walls with a deep, rhythmic knock. The east-facing windows rattled slightly when the wind came off the ridge, which it did most nights between 2 and 4 in the morning. The floorboards on the third-floor landing, directly above her room, had a characteristic creak she'd mapped in her head, so she knew when someone was moving up there and could distinguish it from the settling of a house that was old enough to have opinions about the weather. She knew these things because she'd been paying attention. She paid attention the way she'd learned to pay attention at construction sites in bad weather, not anxiously, not frantically, but with the steady, metabolized alertness of someone who understood that the cost of missing something was structural. On the 8th morning, she came downstairs to find a man she hadn't seen before sitting at the kitchen table. He was about 45, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and set improperly, and he was eating toast with the comfortable authority of someone who belonged in the space. He looked up when she walked in, registered her without particular interest, and went back to his toast. "You're the wife," he said. "You're in my kitchen," she said. He looked up again. Something shifted in his expression. Not hostility exactly, but reassessment. He put the toast down. "Cassian Varga. I run operations for the family." She'd heard the name. Lucian had mentioned it once, briefly, in the context of the Eastern Properties security rotation. She'd filed it. "Serena Holloway," she said, and went to pour coffee because she was not going to stand in the doorway of any room in this house, like she was waiting for permission. "I know who you are." He watched her. His eyes were the kind of light gray that registered as almost colorless, eyes that took everything in without giving anything back. "You've been asking questions about the organization's business holdings." She turned. "My lawyer has been doing research." "Same thing. It's not, actually." He picked up the toast again. "You should tell your lawyer to slow down." Serena looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. He was eating her food in her kitchen and telling her what her lawyer should do, and he said it with the exact quality of a man who was used to saying things once and not repeating himself. And she understood immediately and completely that this was a man who thought she was a piece of furniture that had been moved into the wrong room. "I'll mention it," she said. She didn't mean it, and he knew she didn't mean it, and neither of them addressed this. Lucian appeared in the kitchen doorway 2 minutes later. He looked at Cassian. He looked at Serena. Something moved across his face that she was starting to learn to read. A brief, controlled tightening around the eyes that she'd come to understand meant something had occurred that required management. "Cassian," he said, "the shipping timeline." Cassian stood, picked up his coffee, and left without looking at Serena again. Lucian stayed in the doorway. "How long has he been here?" Serena asked. "He arrived last night. He told me to slow down my lawyer." Lucian was quiet for a moment. "I'll speak with him." "That's not what I'm asking." She set down her cup. "I'm asking whether the man who runs your operations knows about the ledger, knows people are coming after me, and is currently eating breakfast in my kitchen." Another brief silence. "He knows about the ledger." "Does he know what's in it?" "No one knows what's in it," Lucien said. "That's the problem." She looked at him. "Is he one of the people who might be in it?" The question landed in the kitchen and sat there. Lucien's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it, some small, carefully maintained arrangement, shifted. "That's a significant accusation." "I'm not accusing anyone," she said. "I'm asking a structural question. If the ledger exposes criminal and financial connections and your own people don't know what's in it, then every person inside your organization with something to hide has a reason to want it destroyed before anyone finds it." She held his gaze. "That's just how load distribution works." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the coffee maker, poured himself a cup, and stood with his back against the counter. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Nobody ever is." She picked up her cup again. "What did you expect?" "Someone easier to manage. You married me to manage my family's debt, not me." The corner of his mouth moved, almost. "The distinction is becoming relevant." She left him in the kitchen. The second attempt on her life happened on a Tuesday. She was in the East Garden, following the gravel path along the inner fence line, when she heard the suppressed sound. She recognized it only because she'd been on a construction site once when someone had fired a test round from a distance to check acoustics, and the sound had a particular flatness to it that didn't match the ambient noise of the space. She was already dropping before she consciously understood why, going to her knees on the gravel with her hands down, and 2 of Lucien's security personnel were moving past her before she'd fully processed the direction the sound had come from. The fence line, east corner, someone in the tree line beyond the property's boundary. She stayed down. The gravel cut her palms. She could hear her own breathing was fast, too fast. She made herself slow it because fast breathing was loud and loud was information given away for free. She counted. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way she'd taught herself to do during high-stress site assessments when everything was wrong, and the only thing she could control was her own respiratory rate. 40 seconds, 60, 90. One of the security personnel came back and told her to get inside. She got inside. Lucien was waiting in the entrance hall. She walked past him toward the stairs, and he fell into step beside her, and she said, "Don't," without looking at him. "Serena, give me 10 minutes." She kept walking. Her voice was even. Her hands were shaking, which she was aware of and not willing to display. 10 minutes? And then you can explain it. She went to her room. She washed the gravel out of her palms at the bathroom sink and watched the water run pink for a moment before it cleared. She looked at her face in the mirror. She looked like herself. The same face she'd always had. The same dark circles she'd been carrying since the funeral. The same jaw she'd gotten from her father that she'd always thought of as a liability and was currently reconsidering as an asset. She looked like a woman who'd just been shot at in a garden. She looked like a woman who was going to need to make some decisions. She went back downstairs in 8 minutes. Lucien was in the library. He was standing at the window with his phone in his hand, and he turned when she came in and she said, "2 attempts in 8 days. In your house. With your security." She sat down. "Either your people are incompetent or someone inside is providing access." "I know." "Which is it?" He put the phone in his pocket. He sat down across from her. He looked tired, genuinely tired, not performed, the kind of exhaustion that lived in the jaw and the set of the shoulders. "It's not incompetence." The word hung there. "How many people know the full layout of the property?" she asked. "Security rotations, camera positions, the specific path I walked this morning?" He looked at her. "A limited number." "How limited?" 8 people. He paused. "Plus the security detail. And Cassian Varga." He didn't answer immediately. The not answering was its own answer. "Lucien," she leaned forward, "I am not asking you to accuse your own people. I am telling you that someone with access to the interior structure of this estate is funneling information to whoever is sending these people. That is not a theory. That is the only explanation that fits the pattern." She watched his face. "You know this already." "I'm gathering confirmation," he said, which was the most careful way she'd ever heard anyone say yes. She sat back. Outside the window, the security team was doing a perimeter walk, and she could see them moving along the fence line with the unhurried professionalism of people who had done this many times and found nothing unusual, which now struck her as either reassuring or chilling, and she wasn't sure which. "Tell me about the ledger," she said. "Everything, not the version you gave me before." He looked at her for a moment, then he told her. Her father had not simply laundered money. For the first 5 years of the arrangement, the work had been straightforward. Money moved through construction contracts, cleaned, returned. But sometime around year 6, Thomas Holloway had begun keeping records. Not because he was planning to use them as leverage. Lucien believed, and his tone when he said this had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, something almost reluctant, like a concession, that Thomas had done it out of fear. That he had understood somewhere along the way that the people whose money he was moving would eventually decide he was more dangerous alive than dead, and had spent years quietly building something that might keep them honest. What he'd built was encyclopedic. Transactions, names, shell companies, their beneficial owners, their connections to federal contracting processes, to political financing, to international asset transfers, not just the Moretti family's activities, larger networks. People whose names appeared regularly in newspapers, whose foundations held charity galas, whose children attended the right schools. He was building a case, Serena said. He was building insurance. For what? Lucien was quiet. Your father came to me 4 years ago, not through intermediaries, in person. He told me that if anything happened to him, anything that looked like an accident or an illness or a random crime, the records would be released. He gave me copies of 3 pages as proof of what he had. A pause. He also told me something else. She waited. He told me that 3 years before that conversation, during a period when my organization was under significant internal pressure, Lucien stopped, reorganized something internal, and continued. My younger sister was 16. She was in the wrong place during a confrontation between 2 factions that no longer exist. Your father was there. He was a civilian, no reason to get involved, every reason not to. His voice stayed even, very even, the kind of even that required active maintenance. He got her out, drove her to a hospital 2 counties over, Stayed with her until I arrived. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't use it as leverage then or afterward. Serena looked at her hands. Her name is Nina, Lucian said. She's 23 now. She teaches elementary school outside of Philadelphia. The library was very quiet. He never told us, Serena said. Not to Lucian, just said it. No. She sat with that for a moment. Her father, who had spent 14 years moving dirty money through his company, who had built a secret archive that could destroy a dozen powerful people, who had died with both of those things locked inside him, had also once stayed with a frightened 16-year-old girl in a hospital waiting room 2 counties from his home because it was the correct thing to do. She did not know what to do with that. She suspected she wouldn't for a long time. Who else knows about Nina? She asked. Within my organization, 3 people. Cassian? The pause was shorter this time. No. She looked up. He doesn't know that's why you... She stopped. He thinks this is purely about the debt and the ledger. Yes. So he doesn't know that you have a personal reason to keep my family safe that has nothing to do with money. Lucienne met her eyes. Correct. She thought about that, about what it meant within the structure of an organization where people position themselves according to the logic of leverage and advantage. If Cassian Varga didn't know that Lucien's commitment to Serena's safety went beyond a business arrangement, if he thought this was purely transactional, something that could be renegotiated if the math changed, he could move against me, she said, without knowing he was crossing a line. Or knowing exactly, Lucien said quietly, and calculating it was worth crossing. That night, Serena called her brother. Daniel picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting for her call, which told her he was more worried than he was admitting. He was 23 and doing his best, and she loved him with the specific, exhausting love of a sibling who had always understood that she would have to do the harder things so he could do the important ones. Are you okay? He asked immediately. I'm fine. She sat on the edge of the mattress in the center of her room. Are you at the apartment? Yeah, Serena, I've been reading about... He stopped. Mom told me some of what the lawyers said. How much? Enough. His voice was tight with the effort of keeping it level. Enough that I understand why you did what you did. Another stop. I need you to tell me you're actually okay. I'm actually okay, she said, which was approximately 40% true, and which she would fix later when she had better information. I need you to do something for me. Anything. Don't contact me from your regular number after today. Get a prepaid. Don't tell anyone where you're using it from. Text me the number when you have it, and then destroy the packaging. Silence on the other end. Daniel? I heard you. His voice had changed, not the tight, managed voice of before. Something underneath it. Something younger and older at the same time. How bad is it? She looked at her hands. The palms had healed enough that she couldn't see the gravel marks anymore. Manageable, she said. I just like margins. After she hung up, she sat for a moment in the dark room and thought about the word manageable and what it meant to describe as manageable a situation in which she had been shot at twice in 8 days in a house full of armed men, at least one of whom might be routing information to people who wanted her dead. Then she went to the desk and started drawing. She had no drafting equipment. She asked Mrs. Farrow for graph paper the next morning and received it without comment, which was becoming her baseline expectation of Mrs. Farrow, and spent 2 evenings reconstructing from memory what she knew of the estate's layout. The main house, the outbuildings, the camera positions she'd observed on her walks, the security rotation she'd tracked by sound and timing, the tree line beyond the east fence where the shot had come from, the angles available from that position, the sight lines through the garden that it covered and the ones it didn't. She was not a security professional, but she was someone who looked at structures and understood how they failed, and she was starting to have a hypothesis about this one. On the 11th night, she brought the drawings to Lucian. He was in the west wing, the restricted section, and she knocked on the door at the end of the corridor without particular concern for whether she was supposed to be there. A man she recognized from the security detail opened it, looked at her, and after a brief second stepped aside. The room beyond was an office. 2 monitors, a large table covered in papers and maps, a phone setup that suggested a significant volume of communication traffic. Lucien stood up when she came in. "I was told you needed to rest," he said. "I was told the West Wing was restricted." She put the graph paper on his desk. "Look at this." He came around the desk. He looked at the drawings, and she watched his face as he processed them, watched the shift from polite tolerance to actual attention. "The east corner," she said. "From the shot placement Tuesday, the shooter had a direct line through the gap between camera positions 4 and 7. That gap isn't accidental. It's a function of the camera height and the fence angle. But someone standing inside this house looking at the camera schematics wouldn't see it as a gap. They'd see it as covered territory." She pointed. "It's only a gap from outside the fence, at this specific angle, which means whoever told the shooter where to stand had to have known the camera layout and been able to calculate the exterior blind spot from first principles." Lucien was very still. "That's not someone reading a security briefing," she said. "That's someone who understands spatial analysis well enough to model a 3-dimensional blind spot from a 2-dimensional schematic." She looked at him. "How many people in your organization can do that?" He picked up the graph paper. He studied it for a long moment. "One," he said. She waited. He put the paper down. He looked at her with those still, dark eyes, and for the first time since she'd been in this house, she saw something in them that wasn't managed. A small, cold, particular kind of hurt. The kind that came not from surprise, but from confirmation of something you'd been not quite believing for a long time and had just run out of reasons to disbelieve. "Cassian built our security infrastructure," he said, 12 years ago. He designed the camera system himself. The room was very quiet. "He's been here since the beginning," Lucien said, more to himself than to her. "Yes," Serena said, "because that was the structural reality. The man who designed the load-bearing elements of this house's defenses was also the man who best understood where they failed, and the man who had told her to slow down her lawyer, who had those colorless eyes that gave nothing back, who had sat at her kitchen table eating toast with the comfort of someone who believed he was untouchable." Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize, Daniel's new prepaid. It had to be. But the message wasn't what she'd expected. It was 4 words. "They came for me." She looked up at Lucien. His expression, when she showed him the phone, was the first fully unguarded thing she'd seen from him since the morning he'd walked into her father's kitchen and put a marriage contract on the table. And what was on his face was not the measured calculation of a man managing a situation. It was fury. Clean, cold, absolute fury. "Where is he?" Lucien said. "I don't know." Her voice was steady. She was making it steady by force. "The text came from the new number I told him to get. If someone found him through that—" She stopped. "No one knew about the prepaid. I told him on a call from a phone inside this house." The silence that followed was the most dangerous silence she'd experienced yet in this building, and she had experienced several. Because what she'd just said meant one thing and only one thing, and they both understood it simultaneously and completely. The call she'd made to Daniel 3 days ago from a phone inside the Moretti estate had been monitored. And the only people with the access and the knowledge and the reason to monitor her calls were the same people who already knew the camera blind spots and had already sent 2 separate teams through the perimeter. Whoever was feeding information to the outside hadn't stopped with security rotations. They'd been listening to everything. Which meant Cassian Varga didn't just know about the ledger. He knew Daniel existed. He knew where Daniel was. And now Daniel was somewhere Serena didn't know, with someone she couldn't name, and the only man who might be able to find him in time was standing across from her with clean, cold fury on his face and 12 years of misplaced trust burning behind his eyes. "I need to find my brother," she said. "I know," Lucien said. He was already reaching for his phone. The text came from Daniel's prepaid at 11:47 p.m. By midnight, Lucien had 4 teams moving. Serena watched him work from the corner of the operations room, the restricted West Wing space she'd forced her way into 40 minutes ago and had no intention of leaving, and understood for the first time what it actually meant to run something. Not manage, not administer, run. He moved through the room with the focused economy of a man who had been in crisis situations before and had learned to strip everything down to sequence. First this, then this, then this. No wasted motion, no performance. He made calls in a voice so low and level it was almost impossible to hear from across the room, and the people on the other end of those calls moved because he told them to, and that was that. She stayed out of his way and watched and thought. The prepaid phone had been purchased by Daniel at a pharmacy 3 counties from his apartment, per her instructions. He'd texted her from it once, the 4 words, and then gone silent. She'd called back twice. No answer. The phone was either dead, destroyed, or in someone else's hands, and she didn't know which and couldn't afford to assume the best option. What she kept coming back to was the timeline. She had spoken to Daniel from the estate's landline system 3 days ago. The call had lasted 11 minutes. She had told him to get a prepaid phone and text her the number. He had done exactly that, and within 72 hours someone had shown up wherever he was. 3 days. Enough time to locate a prepaid phone purchase if you had access to the right databases. Enough time to run a trace on an outgoing call if you'd been recording the estate's communication traffic. Enough time for someone who already knew Daniel existed to find out exactly where he was, if they'd been handed the specific pharmacy location by someone listening to her end of the call. She was aware that she was constructing a framework with incomplete information. She was also aware that this was what she did under pressure, built structures to stand in, to reason from, because formlessness was the thing she found genuinely unbearable. She needed a shape to push against. Cassian Varga's name was the shape she kept coming back to. At 12:40, one of Lucien's teams reported in from Daniel's apartment building. Serena was standing close enough to the phone speaker to hear the response. The apartment was empty, no signs of struggle, a meal left half-finished on the counter, the front door unlocked, which meant Daniel had left voluntarily or been taken quickly enough that he hadn't been able to fight. Neither option was good. Voluntary departure under threat was still threat. And quickly taken meant someone who knew exactly how long they had before a neighbor noticed or a building camera caught something useful. "The building camera," she said across the room. Lucien turned. He was on a separate call. He held up 2 fingers, 2 minutes, and she nodded and stood and waited with her hands at her sides and her jaw tight. The building camera had been disabled. Not conspicuously, not broken, not spray-painted over. The feed had simply stopped recording at 9:12 p.m., 43 minutes before Daniel's text, and resumed at 9:58. A clean interruption, the kind that required system access rather than physical intervention. "That's not street muscle," Serena said. "Whoever did this had access to the building's security contractor." Lucien ended his call. He looked at her with the same expression he'd been wearing for the past hour. That clean, cold fury, not performed, not telegraphed, just present underneath everything like a current running through concrete. "We're pulling the contractor records now." "It won't be direct," she said. "There'll be a shell. 2 shells probably. But the ownership chain will connect eventually if you have the right." She stopped. "Do you have people who can run that kind of corporate trace?" "Yes." "How fast?" "Fast enough." He moved to the large table and pulled one of the maps toward him. If Cassian moved Daniel, he'd need a holding location, something inside the family's network, or something he controls independently. He looked at the map. "He has 3 properties in his name, and at least 2 I know of that aren't." "How do you know about the ones that aren't in his name?" Lucien looked up. The question was the right one, and they both knew it. Because if he knew about Cassian's off-book properties, that meant he'd been watching Cassian. And if he'd been watching Cassian, he'd had reason to watch him. Which meant the suspicion she'd voiced in the kitchen 5 days ago, the suspicion he'd called a significant accusation, was not new, was not prompted by her graph paper and her camera diagrams, was something he'd been sitting with for a long time. "How long?" she said. He held her gaze. 7 months. 7 months of suspicion, 7 months of watching, of gathering, of the slow and terrible process of building a case against someone you'd trusted for 12 years, who had built the walls of your house and the structure of your organization and sat at your kitchen table and eaten your food. 7 months of not acting because in this world, acting prematurely against the wrong person cost you everything, and waiting to act against the right person could cost you everything else. "You were waiting for proof," she said. "I needed certainty. And now?" He looked back at the map. "Now I have it." She almost said something about the cost of certainty, about what it had cost in the 43 minutes between a disabled camera and a 4-word text message. She didn't say it because it wouldn't help anything and he knew it already. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the specific quality of the way he was looking at the map without seeing the map. He was calculating something that had nothing to do with geography. She went back to watching and thinking. At 2 in the morning, the corporate trace came back partial, but enough. The building security contractor had a subsidiary. The subsidiary had a management company. The management company had a registered agent in Delaware whose name meant nothing to Serena, but clearly meant something to Lucien, because when the man reading the report said the name aloud, Lucien went very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. More internal, more like something being processed at a deep level. Marchetti Holdings, he said. That's Cassian's, said the man with the report. His name was Wren, late 30s, quiet, the kind of man who seemed to have been designed specifically to occupy backgrounds without being noticed until he spoke. He set it up in 2019 under the Delaware registration. I found 3 other subsidiaries off the same parent. One of them owns a property in Westchester County, cold storage and logistics decommissioned as of last year. Lucien looked at Serena. She looked back. How far? She said. 90 minutes. She was already moving toward the door to get her coat. You're not coming, Lucien said. She turned. My brother is in that building. We don't know that yet. Your man just gave us a property owned through a chain connected to Cassian Varga in Westchester, decommissioned last year, which means no active staff, no scheduled visits, easy to secure and easy to disappear. She held his gaze. I'm coming. He looked at her for a long moment. The calculations she could see moving behind his eyes were not about her safety, or not only about that. They were about the shape of what was happening, the weight of what it meant to bring a civilian into an active operation against a man who had designed the security architecture of the family's estate and had 12 years of operational knowledge to draw on. She watched him make the calculation. You stay in the car, he said, until I clear the building. Agreed, she said, which meant until I decide otherwise. They moved out at 2:20 with 2 vehicles and 6 men, and the drive up through the dark was the longest 90 minutes of Serena's life. She sat in the back of the second vehicle between 2 of Lucien's people and watched the highway pass and thought about Daniel eating a half-finished meal and a door left unlocked, and she thought about her father staying with a frightened girl in a hospital waiting room, and she thought about the architecture of betrayal, how it was always built on the inside, how the structural failures were always at the load-bearing points, never the decorative ones, because what betrayal required most was access. The property in Westchester was exactly what Wren had described, a long, low building set back from a service road surrounded by scrub and chain-link fencing, dark in every window. It had the particular desolate quality of industrial spaces that had been useful once and weren't anymore. And in the dark, it had a flat, featureless presence that Serena read immediately as intentional. This was a building designed not to be noticed. Lucien's team moved in with the efficiency she'd come to understand as their baseline. She stayed in the car. She watched through the windshield as figures moved in the dark, as a side door was breached, as lights came on in sequence through the interior windows. She counted the seconds. At 6 minutes, Lucien appeared in the building's main entrance and looked directly at the car. She got out before the man in the driver's seat could stop her. Inside was cold and smelled of old concrete and something that might have been chemicals from the building's previous industrial use. The main space was a long corridor of storage bays, most of them empty, 2 of them not. In the second non-empty bay, Daniel Holloway was sitting on the floor with his back against a support pillar, his wrists zip-tied behind him, a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled and dried, and an expression on his face when he saw Serena that she would not examine too closely for a long time because she had things to do before she could afford to feel what that expression made her feel. She crossed the bay in 8 steps. She got down on her knees in front of him. She looked at his face, the cut, the pallor, the way his breathing was coming too fast but evening out when he saw her, the way a person's body could suddenly remember how to regulate itself when it found something safe to anchor to. Are you hurt anywhere else? She said. My shoulder. His voice was rough. I think it's dislocated. They grabbed me and... He stopped. Reset. I'm okay. I'm okay, Serena. I know, she said, She said it the way you said things that needed to be true before you could afford to determine whether they were. One of Lucien's men cut the zip ties. Another went for a first aid kit from the vehicle. Serena stayed on her knees in front of her brother and held his face in both hands and looked at him. At the real physical present fact of him, blood and dislocated shoulder and all, and did not say any of the things she wanted to say. In the third storage bay, they found something else. It was Lucien who found it, moving through the space with a flashlight while his men managed Daniel's extraction. He came back to the main corridor with a metal case in his hand, the kind used for transport of sensitive equipment, foam-lined interior, combination lock cut off cleanly as though by someone in a hurry. The case was empty, but the interior foam had an impression, the specific, precise impression of something that had lived in that case for a long time. A rectangular object, roughly the dimensions of a thick hardcover book, with a series of smaller indentations along one side that could have been interface ports. Serena looked at the impression. She looked at Lucien. "That's a data drive," she said, "something that was stored here for a long time." "Yes." His voice was very quiet. "Cassian had it. He's been here before us." Lucien set the case down. His jaw was tight. He knew we'd traced the property, which meant the move on Daniel hadn't been about Daniel. Daniel was leverage, a mechanism for pulling Serena somewhere controllable while Cassian retrieved something from this building that he'd needed to move before they found it. She thought about that, about the shape of it. "He used Daniel to create a window," she said slowly. "While we were focused on the text message, on tracing the prepaid, on getting here. He had time to come to this building, retrieve whatever was in that case, and be gone before we arrived." She looked at Lucien. "He's been planning this for longer than 7 months." "Yes," Lucien said, and then, "The ledger." She went very still. "What about it?" 3 weeks ago." He stopped, started again. 3 weeks ago, I received information that someone inside the organization had located a portion of the encoded records your father created. Not the complete archive. A fragment transmitted through one of the wine bottles. We believe someone in your family's wine cellar records gave Cassian access to an inventory that cross-referenced with the vintage distribution logs. He set the empty case down with careful precision, like he was setting down something much heavier. "I didn't tell you because I wasn't certain the information was reliable." Serena stood up straight. Her back ached. Her palms hurt. She had been awake for 19 hours. "Tell me what you weren't certain of," she said. He looked at her. "That your father's message to you, the final one before he died, wasn't about the estate or the debt. We intercepted a notation in your father's personal planner. 3 days before his death, he wrote one line." A pause. "He wrote your name, and then he wrote, 'The winery.'" The word landed in the cold air of the storage bay and didn't dissipate. The Holloway Winery, the old property her father had purchased in 1998 and largely abandoned after the 2008 financial contraction. She'd driven past it twice since his death and thought of it as another piece of the estate's scattered wreckage. Another asset depleted, another thing that had once been something and was now just a structure holding its shape out of habit. "He left me something there," she said. It wasn't a question. "I believe so. And Cassian read the same notation." Lucien met her eyes. "Before we did." The cold in the building felt suddenly sharper. "Then we need to get there first," she said. If he already had what he needed from the winery, he wouldn't have needed to take Daniel." She was thinking out loud, building the structure quickly in her head, testing the joints. "Daniel was leveraged to move me, to move us. That means he needed time. Time at the winery, or time moving the case from here, or both. But if the winery had already given him everything he needed, he'd have moved against me directly." She looked at Lucien. "He's not done. Whatever my father left there, Cassian hasn't fully accessed it yet. That's the only configuration that fits." Lucien looked at her for a long moment in the cold light of the empty storage bay, and she could see him running the same logic, testing it, finding it held. "The winery is 4 hours from here," he said. "Then we leave now." They left Daniel in the care of two men with instructions to take him to a safe house outside the city, not the estate, nowhere Cassian had mapped. And Serena said goodbye to her brother in the parking lot of the decommissioned building at 3:15 in the morning with the brevity of people who understand they don't have time for the conversation they need to have. "I'll explain everything when this is over," she told him. He looked at her with his shoulder immobilized and his face cleaned up and his eyes very clear in the dark. "I know you will," he said, which was the most generous thing anyone had said to her in weeks. They drove through the remainder of the night. Lucien sat in the front. She sat in the back again, but this time she didn't watch the highway. She watched the back of his head and thought about what she knew and what she didn't, and what the difference was going to cost her. At 4:30, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it for one ring, two rings, and then something, instinct or structural intuition, or just the particular quality of the timing, made her answer. "Miss Holloway." The voice was Cassian Vargas, and it was the most relaxed she'd ever heard it. He sounded like a man who had just sat down after a long walk. "I owe you an explanation." She looked at the back of Lucien's head. He had turned at the sound of the phone, and now he was watching her in the rear-view mirror with those still dark eyes. She held up one finger and pointed at the phone, and he gave her the smallest possible nod. "Go ahead," she said to Cassian. "Your father was a careful man," Cassian said. "Careful and ultimately afraid. It took me 11 years to understand why he kept those records. I thought at first it was about leverage. The way careful men always want leverage, always want something they can threaten to drop if the circumstances become unfavorable." A pause. But he wasn't building leverage. He was building a case, and not against Lucien. She said nothing. Let him move. "Your father discovered, approximately 9 years ago, that the money flowing through his construction company wasn't just Moretti family funds. There were additional sources Lucien didn't know about. Investors, you might call them, though investors is generous, people who were using the Moretti family's laundering infrastructure without Lucien's knowledge or consent, routed through contracts your father controlled." Another pause. "People who would be significantly damaged by the exposure of those routes. And you were facilitating that," she said. "The additional routing." Silence. Then, "I built the infrastructure, yes, over several years. The additional parties were lucrative. The arrangement was clean. No one was supposed to know. Until my father started documenting it. Until Thomas Holloway decided that what he knew was worth more as evidence than as a secret." His voice had taken on an edge now. Not anger exactly, something more personal. "He was going to expose me, Miss Holloway. Not Lucien, me. He'd spent 9 years building a file that would end my life's work in an afternoon." She was very still. The car was dark and moving, and Lucien was watching her in the mirror, and she kept her face neutral with the specific effort of someone performing calm they did not feel. "So you had him killed," she said. The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. "His heart attack was his own," Cassian said. "I won't take credit for biology, but I will tell you that the stress he was living under in those final months was, partly, engineered." A pause. "I needed him frightened enough to make mistakes. Instead, he made his last move. He hid the ledger. And told you where to find it, or thought he did." The warmth that had been in Cassian's voice earlier was gone now. What was underneath it was colder and far more honest. "I've been in the winery, Miss Holloway. I've spent the past 6 hours taking it apart very carefully, and I have not found what I came for." A pause. "Which means your father's message to you wasn't in the notation. The notation was misdirection. He was a careful man, as I said." "Well, then why are you calling me?" "Because you're going to find it," Cassian said simply. "And when you do, you're going to give it to me. Or I release to every media outlet with whom I have existing relationships a very complete and very compelling narrative in which Lucien Moretti is responsible for your father's death, Daniel Holloway's kidnapping, and a series of additional activities that will ensure he spends the remainder of his life in federal custody." A pause. "The narrative is well documented. I've had years to prepare it." Serena said nothing. You have until sunrise, Cassian said. When you find what your father left you, you'll call this number. I'll give you instructions for the transfer, and everyone goes home. He hung up. The car was quiet. Through the windshield, the highway was lightening at its very eastern edge, the first gray dissolving of dark into not dark that came before any actual dawn. They had perhaps 2 hours before sunrise. She lowered the phone. Lucien had pulled off the highway onto a service road during the call. They were stopped now, the engine running, the headlights cutting a path through nothing in particular. He's been in the winery, she said. I heard. He didn't find it. Also heard. Lucien turned fully in the seat to look at her. Your father left you something that a man who has spent 6 hours dismantling a building couldn't find, which means it's not in the building's structure. He paused. You said you'd driven past the winery twice since your father's death. Yes? Did you go inside? Once. Briefly. She thought back. The winery had been dim and musty. Most of the equipment sheeted in canvas, racks of old inventory still on the walls. Bottles her father had never bothered to sell or move. She'd stood in the main production room for about 10 minutes, feeling the particular weight of a space that had once been alive with purpose and was now just a room full of things. She'd touched the old wine press in the center of the room, out of, she wasn't sure, something reflexive. A machine built to extract the essential quality from something and leave the rest behind. She'd put both palms on the iron surface of it and stood there for a moment and felt. She sat up. The press, she said. Lucien looked at her. The antique wine press in the main room. He bought it in 1994 from a vineyard in Burgundy. He talked about it. She stopped. Something her father had said once at a dinner she'd been half listening to because she'd been in her 20s and had thought she had time to listen properly later. Something about the Burgundy press being the first thing he'd purchased for the winery, before the equipment, before the inventory, before anything. His first real acquisition. The thing he'd been most proud of, in the particular possessive way he'd been proud of things. Not the company, not the house, the press. He said once that everything worth keeping should be built into the thing that does the work, she said slowly. I thought he was talking about the winery in general, about the philosophy of production. She looked at Lucien. He wasn't talking about philosophy. Lucien looked at her for 1 second. Then he put the car back in drive. They reached the winery at 6:14 in the morning, 22 minutes before technical sunrise. The building had been worked over. She could see it immediately from the entrance. Crates moved, flooring disturbed in sections. The sheeted equipment pulled back and replaced with the imprecision of someone searching quickly, trying to cover their tracks in a building they hadn't expected to leave empty-handed. Cassian's work. 6 hours of it. The antique wine press stood in the center of the main room exactly where she'd last seen it, and it looked, at first glance, untouched. She crossed to it and put her hands on the iron frame and looked at it, really looked at it the way she looked at structures, not to admire them, but to understand them. The press mechanism was driven by a central iron screw, perhaps 4 inches in diameter, descending from a crossbeam above the press bed. She looked at the screw. At its upper end, where the iron met the wooden crossbeam housing. At the slight irregularity in the housing that she had registered on her first visit and dismissed as age, as the natural deterioration of 19th century joinery. She got her hands around the housing cap at the screw's upper end. She turned it. It resisted. She turned harder. Her palms, still tender from the gravel 3 days ago, registered the protest, and she pushed through it. The cap came free. Inside the hollow of the housing, sealed in a layer of wax and wrapped in oilcloth, was a small flat object approximately the size of a paperback novel. She unwrapped it with hands that were not steady. She was aware of this and didn't try to fix it. Some things didn't need to be managed. It was a drive. Old model, the kind designed for durability over speed, with interface ports down one side exactly matching the impressions she'd seen in the empty foam case in Westchester. Her father hadn't just built one copy. He'd built a backup. And he'd hidden it here, inside the first thing he'd ever been proud of, because that was where he'd learned you kept the things that mattered. She was still holding it when the building's side entrance opened. She turned. Cassian Varga walked in with 2 men behind him, and a patience on his face That was the most frightening thing she'd seen since this had started, because it was the patience of someone who had already calculated how this ended. "I thought you might not call," he said. "So I came to you." He looked at the drive in her hands. "I'll take that." Behind him in the doorway, she could see no sign of Lucien's vehicles. She looked at Cassian and understood, with the absolute structural clarity of someone trained to identify the exact point at which a load-bearing element fails, that she was alone in a building with the man who had her father's blood on his hands, and her brother's fear in his voice, and 12 years of betrayal in his ledger, and that the drive in her hands was the only leverage she had left in the world, and that the next decision she made was going to determine whether any of it had been worth anything at all. She looked at Cassian Varga. She thought about her father's hands on this press, about a 16-year-old girl in a hospital waiting room, about Daniel's face in the cold light of an empty warehouse, about a man who had stood in her kitchen and put a marriage contract on a table and told her he wouldn't forget one correct thing. She held the drive at her side. "You want this," she said. "Tell me the truth first. All of it. Everything you took from both families. Everything you stole." Her voice was flat and cold and very steady. "I want to hear you say it out loud." Cassian looked at her with those colorless eyes. And slowly, with the confidence of a man who had already won and knew it, he began to smile. Cassian Varga smiled with the patience of a man who had never once in his life been caught at anything that mattered. It was the smile that did it. Not the two men behind him, not the gun visible at the hip of the one on the left, not the cold morning light coming through the winery's high windows, or the smell of old wood and fermentation that had soaked into the walls over decades. It was the smile, that specific, unhurried, already won quality of it, that told Serena everything she needed to know about how the next 10 minutes were going to go if she let them go the way Cassian had planned them. She kept her face neutral. She kept the drive at her side. "The truth," Cassian said, with the tone of a man repeating a word in a language he found quaint. "All right." He took 3 steps into the room and stopped, and his men fanned slightly to either side without being told, which meant they'd done this before, which meant this was a choreography they'd rehearsed. "Your father moved money for the Moretti family for 14 years. During that time, I identified additional parties who required similar services, parties with significantly larger volumes and significantly less patience for organizational red tape." He put his hands in his coat pockets, casual, at ease. "I built a parallel infrastructure using the same construction routes your father managed. He discovered this approximately 9 years ago. He spent the following years documenting it, quietly, in the way of a man who believes information is the same thing as safety." A pause. "He was wrong about that." "He's dead," Serena said. "So yes." Something moved in Cassian's eyes. Not guilt. Closer to irritation. The particular irritation of a man who found other people's morality both predictable and tedious. He brought it on himself. I gave him 3 separate opportunities to step away from what he'd built. He declined each time. "You engineered his death." "I accelerated a biological process that was already in motion." He said it with the precision of someone who had told himself this particular version enough times that it had become simply fact. The man had a heart condition since 2015. His cardiologist's records are quite clear on that point. He tilted his head. "I arranged for the stress. His heart arranged for the rest." She looked at him. Her hands were steady. She was making them steady. "And the money. What you stole from both families." "Stole is uncharitable. I reallocated funds through routes I built with my own expertise, over a decade of my own work, on behalf of parties who valued that work appropriately." His voice stayed even. "The Moretti family's legitimate accounts were never touched. Lucien's personal finances were never accessed. What I took was from the operational surplus, money that would have moved through the system and disappeared into accounts nobody was watching with any real attention." $52 million, she said. He almost smiled again. "Well, it's considerably more than that, over the full period." Outside, somewhere beyond the winery's east wall, she heard something, a sound that was neither wind nor the settling of the building, a faint, engine-related sound that came and went and was gone before she could place it. She kept her eyes on Cassian and did not look toward the wall. You framed Lucien for my father's murder, she said. I prepared documentation, yes, in the event it became necessary. He looked at the drive in her hand. It has become necessary. Because of what's on this. What's on that drive ends careers, Miss Holloway. Political careers, financial careers, the careers of men whose names you would recognize from newspaper headlines and quarterly earnings reports. Men who paid me very well to ensure their involvement in certain financial activities remained private. He took one more step toward her. And who will pay me considerably more to ensure this drive is destroyed and every copy with it. There are multiple copies, she said. Your father made 3. I've accounted for 2. He looked at the drive with a directness that was almost hunger. That's the 3rd. She held it up slightly, just enough to let him see she was aware of its weight. And if I give this to you, what happens to me? His expression arranged itself into something that was trying to be reassurance and landing somewhere closer to contempt. You walk out of here. Your brother is already free. Your mother retains the estate. The Holloway debt has already been legally cleared through the marriage contract. A pause. There's no reason for further conflict. No reason except that I know everything you just told me. You know a version of events that I can thoroughly discredit through documentation I've spent years preparing. He held her gaze. You're a structural engineer, Miss Holloway. Your credibility in matters of organized crime finance is limited, against mine, in the contexts that matter. He extended his hand, palm up. The drive. And we're done. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She said no. The word was not loud. It was not dramatic. It landed in the cold air of the winery with the specific weight of a load-bearing decision, the kind that once made could not be unmade, that immediately redistributed everything else in the structure. Cassian's expression didn't change. Not the smile, not the patience, not the particular quality of his certainty. What changed was his eyes. They went from the gray of assessment to the gray of something much older and much less considered. He looked at the man on his left and nodded once. The man moved, and from outside, through the winery's east wall, the engine sound she'd heard 30 seconds ago returned, louder now, multiple engines, the specific combined register of vehicles moving fast across unpaved ground. And the east wall's loading door blew inward. Not exploded, breached. A vehicle had driven directly through it, and through the gap came Lucien's people, 4 of them through the door before the debris had settled, and the man Cassian had nodded at made a decision in the fraction of a second available to him, and chose the wrong one. What happened next was very fast and very loud and not clean. Serena had 3 seconds of warning. The load door going, the sudden compression of noise in the enclosed space, the man on the left swinging toward the new threat. And she used those 3 seconds to move laterally toward the antique press, putting 800 pounds of iron between herself and the room's center. She went down behind it on her knees and kept the drive pressed against her chest with both arms and made herself small against the base of the machine. The sound inside the winery was the worst thing she'd ever heard. Enclosed space, stone walls, the flat hard crack of firearms, and the secondary sounds underneath. Impact, debris, a man's voice cutting off mid-word. She kept her head down. She counted her own heartbeats because it was something to measure, something concrete, because the alternative was to listen to what was happening on the other side of the press, and she couldn't afford the data right now. 14 beats, 20, 30. The primary noise peaked and stopped. Stopped the way storms stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, a sudden transition from overwhelming to something that was almost silence, broken only by movement and breathing and a voice she recognized saying something in a low, precise tone that she couldn't make out from behind the press. She straightened. She looked over the top of the press. Lucien was standing in the center of the winery. He was bleeding. Left side, somewhere below the ribs. She could see the dark spread of it against his coat, the way he was holding himself fractionally compensated to the right, the micro-adjustment of a man managing pain without stopping. He was upright. He was present. His eyes found her immediately across the room. "Are you hit?" he said. "No." She stood up fully. Her knees hurt from the concrete. "You're bleeding." "I'm aware." He looked at her hands, at the drive pressed against her chest. Something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, and then something she wasn't ready to name. "You held on to it." It wasn't a complicated decision, she said, which was a lie, and they both knew it. Two of Cassian's men were down on the winery floor, neither of them moving in any concerning direction. The third, the one on the right, who hadn't moved when Cassian nodded, was being managed against the far wall by one of Lucien's team, hands behind his head, expression of a man who had correctly identified the moment to stop. Cassian was gone. She scanned the room. The loading door hung at an angle, light coming through from the outside. The side entrance she'd come in through was still closed. Every other opening in the space was accounted for. "He's not here," she said. "North exit." Lucien was already moving, one hand pressed against his side. "Ren." From outside the loading door, a voice responded. 2 words. "Moving east." She followed Lucien through the blown loading door and out into the pale early morning, and the cold hit her like a correction. After the enclosed heat of the winery, the compressed noise and cordite and fear, the outside air felt aggressively real. The sky was the color of old iron. The sun hadn't properly cleared the ridge yet. The winery's north face had a secondary door. She hadn't registered on entry, and it was open, and beyond it were tire tracks in the wet ground moving east toward the service road. Lucien looked at the tracks. He looked east. He looked at the tree line 200 meters out. He pulled out his phone with his free hand. The other was still pressed against his side, and made a call that lasted 4 seconds. Then he looked at her. "Vehicle's been disabled," he said. "He's on foot in the tree line." "How?" "We tracked his approach before he made entry. His vehicle is parked on the service road." A pause. "It was straightforward to disable while he was inside." She looked at him. "You knew he was coming here. I knew he hadn't found what he came for, and I knew—" He stopped. Reset. "I knew that when you found it first, he'd come to you, so I let him think he had more time than he did." His voice was careful, not apologetic exactly, something more considered. "I needed him to move so I could confirm everything, not from Ren's corporate trace, from Cassian himself." She understood what he was saying. He'd needed Cassian to commit, to take the step from preparation to action, to show himself completely, because in the world he operated in, almost evidence and probable cause were not the same as certainty, and certainty was the only thing that protected everyone, including her. "You used me as the mechanism," she said, "to draw him out." "Yes." Straight, no flinching from it. She thought about that for exactly 2 seconds. "You could have told me. You would have performed it differently." She met his eyes. "Which might have tipped him off." A pause. "I know. I understand the logic." Her voice had an edge she didn't try to smooth. "I'm just telling you that we're going to discuss it later." "Yes," he said. "We are." From the tree line, a sound. Movement. Someone covering ground fast in undergrowth that didn't want to be covered fast through. Ren's voice came through Lucien's phone, reporting position. North-northeast, moving toward the vineyard's old access road, which connected the winery's rear property to the service road 2 miles east. 2 miles of open ground or covered timber. Cassian would know that. Cassian had probably memorized this property's layout the same way he'd memorized everything else, thoroughly, in advance, as a matter of professional habit. "He has another vehicle," Serena said. "On the access road." Lucien looked at her. "He's not running blind," she said. "He planned for extraction. He always plans for extraction. That's what 12 years of contingency thinking looks like. He came here expecting to leave with the drive. When that failed, he went to secondary exit. The access road is," she thought, "a mile and a half from here on foot through the timber. At his pace, 12 minutes. Lucien was already talking to Ren. They moved. She ran with Lucien's people across the winery's rear property, and she was aware that she was a civilian in running boots and a coat that was not designed for this, and that none of that was relevant. She kept pace. Her lungs told her what they thought of this arrangement, and she didn't negotiate with them. Lucien ran beside her, and he was bleeding through his coat, and he was running anyway, and she looked at him twice in the movement across the open ground, and both times he looked back and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and the time for useful things was on the other side of the next 12 minutes. The access road came into view through the timber's edge. A gravel strip, barely maintained, cutting east-west through the vineyard's rear property, and on it, 100 meters from where the tree line ended, a dark sedan sat running with its lights off. Cassian was 40 meters from the car. He was moving fast for a man his age, fast and direct, with the forward-leaning urgency of someone who had already reprocessed the situation and was operating in survival mode rather than planning mode. He didn't look back. That was almost impressive. The discipline of not looking back, of trusting his own assessment of the distance behind him and not burning the second it cost to check. He was 30 meters from the car when Ren came out of the timber 20 meters ahead of it. Cassian stopped. He stood in the gravel road in the early morning light and looked at Ren, and then he turned and looked at the people coming out of the timber behind him, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that lasted perhaps 3 seconds total. Calculation, reassessment, the specific and unmistakable moment when a man who has spent his entire life winning encounters the clean fact of having lost. And then it settled. Settled into something that looked, from where Serena stood, like anger without anywhere left to go. Lucien came to a stop 10 feet from him. They looked at each other, these two men, and the weight of 12 years sat in the gravel road between them like something physical. "You built everything I have," Lucien said. His voice was very even, very quiet. The bleeding had soaked further through his coat, and he was standing with that compensated rightward lean, and none of it was in his voice. The security, the operations structure, half the legitimate businesses. A pause. "You were the best person I knew at the work." Cassian's jaw worked. And yet, Lucien held his eyes. "How long?" "Longer than you want to know." "Tell me anyway." The road was quiet, birds somewhere in the timber. The sedan's engine idling 30 meters away, patient and futile. Cassian looked at him with those colorless eyes, and for the first time since Serena had met him, the control dropped. Just slightly, just at the edges, enough to show what was underneath, which was not remorse and was not fear, but was something rawer than either. Something that had been building pressure for a long time behind a face trained never to show pressure. "You inherited everything," Cassian said. "I built everything. Those are two different things, and they were always going to produce two different outcomes, and you never—" He stopped. "You never once considered that." Lucien was quiet for a moment. "You should have said so." "And what would you have done?" The control was back, sealed over, the pressure resubmerged. "Given me a title? A percentage? A seat at a table you'd been born to?" He looked at Lucien with something that wasn't quite hatred and wasn't quite grief. "I took what I built, that's all." "You took $52 million and left a man's family with a debt they couldn't pay. You murdered Thomas Holloway through proxy and fear, and then tried to use his daughter as a tool to finish what you started." Lucien's voice was still even, still quiet. But underneath it, in the very architecture of how he was standing, was the clean, cold fury she'd seen in the operations room. Not performed, not directed, just present. "You didn't take what you built. You burned down what I built and charged me for the wood." Cassian said nothing. "Get on your knees," Lucien said. A long beat. Cassian Varga, who had run operations for the Moretti family for 12 years, who had built the security infrastructure of an estate and the financial scaffolding of a criminal organization and the parallel routing of money for men whose names appeared in newspapers, who had engineered the death of a frightened man and kidnapped a 23-year-old and sent 2 teams of armed men through the windows of a house to kill a woman he'd decided was inconvenient. Cassian Varga got on his knees in the gravel of an access road in a vineyard at 6:40 in the morning, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she'd ever seen from him, and it was terrible. She looked away. She was still holding the drive. She looked down at it, this small, flat, unimpressive object that her father had sealed in wax and hidden inside a machine he'd been proud of, that contained years of careful, frightened documentation, that had cost him his life and her family everything, and had just cost Cassian Varga his freedom. She turned it over in her hands once. Then she looked at Lucien. He was watching her. "There are names on this," she said. Not just Cassian, the people he was routing money for, politicians, financial people, federal connections. She held his gaze. What happens to it matters. I know. If your people keep it. I know, Serena. She looked at him, at the blood soaking through his coat, at the particular quality of exhaustion on his face that wasn't physical, or wasn't only physical. The exhaustion of a man who had spent 7 months watching and waiting and calculating and had just watched 12 years of misplaced trust get on its knees in a gravel road. There's a journalist, she said, and an international financial crimes unit, independent of any domestic federal connection that might be compromised. She paused. My lawyer knows both. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved across his face that wasn't the managed stillness, wasn't the cold fury, wasn't any of the things she'd cataloged in the weeks she'd spent watching him work. It was something simpler and more difficult than any of those things. Yes, he said. All right. She nodded once. She put the drive in her coat pocket and felt the weight of it settle there. Not light, not heavy, exactly the weight it was. And looked at the access road, the timber, the pale iron sky above it all. One of Lucien's men came forward to manage Cassian, and Cassian went without resistance, which was its own kind of statement. The statement of a man who understood that the calculation had finalized and that further resistance was not more courage, but only more cost. He walked toward the vehicles at the winery with his hands behind his back and his jaw set and his colorless eyes on the middle distance, and he didn't look at Serena as he passed her. She turned to Lucien. You need to stop bleeding, she said. Yes. He looked at her. You held the drive. You already said that. I know. A pause. I'm saying it again. She looked at him in the gray morning light of her dead father's vineyard, bleeding through his coat, standing upright through what had to be a significant amount of effort, and she thought about the distance between the man who had put a contract on her kitchen table and the man standing in front of her now. About whether those were two different men or the same man seen from different angles, the way a structure looked different depending on where you stood in relation to it. Can you walk? She said. Yes. Then walk, she said. I'll call Priya from the car. She started toward the winery and he fell into step beside her, and neither of them spoke, but the silence between them had changed its character, was no longer the silence of managed distance or strategic withholding, but something else, something that had been building without either of them naming it through 3 weeks of broken windows and cold mornings, and a drive hidden in a press and a man on his knees in gravel. From behind them, carried faintly on the cold morning air, came the sound of sirens, distant, approaching. Serena looked at Lucien. I called Priya before we left the car, she said. I told her where we were going and what we were likely to find. A pause. She called the right people. His expression went through something complex. Not anger. Not quite. Something with more texture than that. You made that call before you knew how this would end. I made it before I knew if you were going to come through that loading door. She held his gaze. I needed a version of this that worked, even if you didn't. He looked at her for a long moment in the cold morning light. That was... He stopped. Correct? She offered. The corner of his mouth moved. I was going to say something else. I know. She looked forward. Say it later. They walked toward the winery and the sirens grew and the sky above the ridge was finally, reluctantly, beginning to turn from iron to something approximating light, and in her coat pocket the drive sat with the weight of every name her father had spent 9 frightened years writing down, every transaction, every connection, every piece of the architecture of corruption that had cost him his life and was about to cost a great many other people considerably more than that. The morning was coming, and Cassian Varga, in the back of a vehicle on a gravel access road in a vineyard, was about to watch the empire he'd built through 12 years of patient betrayal begin to come apart in the time it took for a data transfer to complete and a journalist to open an encrypted email. But that wasn't finished yet. Lucien stopped walking. She turned. He was standing 5 feet behind her, and he had his hand pressed hard against his side, and the blood had soaked through to his fingers now, and his face had the particular gray quality of a man who has been running on adrenaline and has just run out. Lucien. He went down to one knee. Not collapsed, controlled. The specific, deliberate movement of someone choosing to go down rather than fall down, which was a distinction that mattered to him, she understood, in a way she didn't have time to examine right now. She was beside him in 3 steps, her hand on his shoulder, and he looked up at her and his eyes were very clear and very dark and very steady. "The drive," he said. "I have it. Don't let go of it." "I won't." She looked at his side, at the blood between his fingers. "We need to get you in a moment." He held her gaze. "I need to tell you something first." "It can wait," she said. "It can't." His voice was still even, still the managed evenness she'd come to recognize as the most honest register he had. Not cold, not performed, just stripped down to what was essential. "I didn't bring you into this house because of the debt." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "That's what the contract said. That's what I told Cassian. That's what everyone believed. A breath, careful, managing something. But the debt was already cleared 3 months before your father died. I cleared it privately. He didn't know. I did it because of Nina." His jaw was tight. Not from pain, from the specific effort of saying true things plainly. "When he died and Cassian started moving, when I understood that whoever had those records was in danger from inside my own organization, I needed you somewhere I could watch over, somewhere the variables were controlled." A pause. "The contract was the mechanism, but the reason was—" "Don't," she said quietly. He stopped. "Not here," she said. "Not on your knees bleeding on a gravel path." She held his gaze. "Stand up. Get to the car. Let someone look at your side." A beat. "And then tell me." He looked at her for one long moment. Then he stood up. The hospital was 40 minutes from the vineyard, and Lucian didn't speak for most of it. He sat in the back seat with his hand pressed against the wound, and his head back against the rest, and his eyes open, watching the ceiling of the vehicle with the focused inward quality of a man doing inventory. Not of the situation outside him, but of something internal, something he was counting and cataloging with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. She sat beside him and kept her hand over his, pressing down, maintaining pressure, and neither of them remarked on this. Ren drove. One of Lucien's other men was in the front passenger seat on a phone that didn't stop. Outside the window, the morning was fully arrived now. Pale and flat, the kind of October morning that gave no warmth, only light. They passed through 2 small towns, and the vineyard country fell away behind them and became suburb. And then the hospital appeared at the end of a long access road, and the vehicle stopped. He walked in under his own power. She watched him do it and understood that this also mattered to him, the walking in, and she didn't offer her arm. She walked beside him through the entrance and through triage and into an examination room, and when the nurse asked her to wait outside, she sat in a plastic chair in the corridor and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them, at the palms still faintly marked from the gravel of the garden, at the blood on her fingers that wasn't hers, and thought about the fact that she'd been running on the chemical certainty of crisis for the past 6 hours, and that at some point in the very near future, her body was going to present her with a bill for that. She took the drive out of her coat pocket and held it. This small thing, this flat, unimpressive rectangle of engineered storage that her father had sealed in wax in the dark of an old press because he'd been a frightened man trying to build something that would outlast his fear. She turned it over once. The interface ports caught the fluorescent light of the hospital corridor. She called Priya. It was 7:22 in the morning, and Priya answered on the first ring, which meant she hadn't slept, which meant she'd been waiting. "Tell me," Priya said. "Cassian Varga is in custody," Serena said. "Lucien's people have him. The authorities who responded to your call arrived at the vineyard property approximately 20 minutes after we left it. The situation there is—" She paused. "Complex. Lucien's men will need legal management." "Already on it." The sound of typing. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Lucien Moretti?" "Gunshot wound, left side. He's in treatment now, non-critical." She paused. "Priya." The drive. A beat. "I have the contact at the financial crimes unit standing by," Priya said. her voice dropping to the specific register she used when something was both very important and very irreversible. And the journalist. She's based out of New York, International Finance Desk, 12 years covering exactly this kind of corporate criminal intersection. She's trustworthy. A pause. Once we transmit, there's no pulling it back. I know. The names on this drive, if what you've described is accurate, we're talking about people with significant resources and significant motivation to respond to exposure. A pause. This will not be a quiet process. Nothing about this has been quiet, Serena said. No. Another pause. Are you ready? She looked at the drive in her hand. She thought about her father sitting alone in his study on a Tuesday morning, 68 years old, with a heart that was already failing and a secret that had been eating him for 9 years. She thought about what it must have cost him to keep building that archive, year after year, knowing what it contained and knowing what it meant, and knowing that the man across the table from him at Moretti family meetings was the man he was building it against. She thought about him buying that wine press in 1994 because it was the first thing he'd been proud of, and hiding the most important thing he'd ever done inside it. She thought about what she wanted to do with what he'd left her. Yes, she said, I'm ready. Tell me what you need. What Priya needed took 4 hours. Serena sat in the hospital corridor and walked her lawyer through every detail she could provide about the drive's contents based on what Cassian had told her in the winery. The additional routing, the shell companies, the names of the parties who had paid him to build the parallel infrastructure. Priya recorded it all with the focused, methodical quality of someone who had spent 20 years turning chaos into documentation. And by noon, she had enough to begin the transmission process with an encrypted transfer protocol that the Financial Crimes Unit's technical team managed from their end. The journalist received her copy at 12:47. Serena knew the exact time because Priya texted it to her. 12:47. She has it. She's reading. She sat with her phone in her lap in the plastic chair and felt the specific, irrevocable quality of something that could not be undone, and waited for whatever came next. What came next, in the immediate term, was a doctor appearing from the examination room to tell her that the patient had a clean through-and-through wound that had missed everything critical, that he'd received stitches and a significant volume of medical advice about rest, and that he was asking for her. She went in. Lucien was sitting up on the examination table with his shirt off and a bandage covering the left side of his torso, and he looked like a man who had been shot and stitched up and was not going to let either of these facts slow him down for longer than medically necessary. His color was better. His eyes were clear. He looked at her when she came in, and she could see him running the same rapid assessment on her that she was running on him, checking for damage, cataloging the visible evidence of the past several hours, arriving at a conclusion. It's done, she said. Transmitted 40 minutes ago. He was quiet for a moment. Both recipients. Yes. He absorbed this with the same inward quality he'd had in the car. That careful counting inventory. Then he said, Cassian's documentation, the narrative he prepared implicating me. She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it in the corridor while she waited, and she talked to Priya about it, and she had an answer. Priya has people pulling his prepared files now. His legal team, the ones who built that documentation, were retained through one of the shell companies that's about to be exposed. They won't have much appetite for honoring that arrangement when the shells collapse. A pause. And the Financial Crimes Unit's interest in Cassian as a cooperative source is going to significantly exceed their interest in any narrative he prepared against you. He has more to offer than you do. She held his gaze. Counterintuitive, but true. He'll deal, Lucian said. He'll try to deal. She sat down in the single chair beside the examination table. Priya thinks the exposure is too broad for a deal to contain. Too many independent sources now. Too many investigative threads that don't run through Cassian. She looked at her hands. He spent 12 years building something he thought was bulletproof, and my father spent 9 years building the bullet. The room was quiet for a moment. The people on the drive, Lucian said. The additional parties he was routing for. There are 9 of them. She'd seen the preliminary list from Priya's initial scan. 2 sitting federal officials, 3 corporate executives in the financial sector, a state attorney general, a senior partner at a lobbying firm with defense contracts. She paused. And two names I didn't recognize, which Priya says are connected to international banking entities currently under separate investigation in 3 European jurisdictions. Lucien looked at the wall for a moment. Your father, he said, was more thorough than I understood. He was scared for a long time, she said. Scared people who are also careful can build extraordinary things. She looked at him. He wasn't a good man in every dimension, but he built something that's going to matter to a lot of people who never knew his name. The doctor came back in to go over discharge instructions, and Lucien listened with the polite, focused attention of someone who intended to follow approximately half of what he was being told and was too experienced to say so. Serena listened more carefully because someone was going to have to manage his actual recovery, and it was not going to be him. They left the hospital at 2 in the afternoon. In the car, she called Daniel. He answered on the second ring again. She could hear from the quality of the ambient sound that he was indoors, somewhere quiet, and from the speed of his answer that he'd been holding the phone. It's over, she said. A long silence. Over, he said. Cassian Varga is in custody. The records are transmitted. The people who were using Dad's infrastructure to move money are about to have very significant problems. A pause. You can go back to your apartment. I'd suggest changing the locks. Another silence. Longer. She could hear him breathing. Serena. His voice had that younger and older quality again, the one she'd heard in the parking lot of the decommissioned warehouse. Are we okay? Mom has the estate. The debt is cleared legally and completely. She paused. We're okay, Daniel. That's what I'm telling you. She heard him exhale. It was the most complete sound she'd heard in 3 weeks. The weeks that followed were not quiet. The transmission triggered a cascade that Priya had predicted accurately, and that was still somehow larger in its actual dimensions than any prediction could fully capture. The journalist's first piece ran 4 days after the transmission, and it landed the way things landed when they were genuinely supported by documentation rather than inference, not with the dramatic spike of rumor, but with the slow, grinding weight of evidence that couldn't be walked back. Financial crimes units in 3 countries opened formal investigations within the first 2 weeks. 2 of the 9 names on Cassian's additional parties list resigned from their positions before the second week ended. The 3rd federal official issued a statement through lawyers and went silent. Cassian Varga's attempt to negotiate a cooperation deal stalled when the Financial Crimes Unit determined, as Priya had predicted, that his value as a source was substantially lower than his value as a defendant, given the completeness of the documentary record Thomas Holloway had assembled. He retained a defense attorney whose name Serena recognized from high-profile federal cases, and who was, by all accounts, very good. It wasn't going to be enough. The Holloway estate's debt clearance was confirmed in writing by the Moretti family's legal representatives, signed and filed, on the 22nd day after the winery. Serena's mother received the document by courier and called Serena immediately and read it out loud over the phone in its entirety, in the careful, word-by-word way of someone who needed to hear a thing fully formed in the air before they could believe it. Eleanor Holloway did not say anything about Lucien. She did not ask about the marriage contract or what it meant now or what Serena intended. She said, when she'd finished reading, "Your father tried, at the end. I want you to know I understand that now." Serena said, "I know, Mom." Eleanor said, "Come home when you can." Serena said, "Soon." On the 28th day, she found the divorce papers on the desk in her suite at the Moretti estate. They were in a manila envelope, unsealed, with her name written on the front in Lucien's handwriting, the same precise, angular script she'd seen on operational documents in the West Wing office. She opened the envelope and took out the papers and read them. They were complete. Her name, his name, the legal dissolution of a marriage that had lasted 28 days and had been contracted under conditions that no family court judge in the country would have considered entirely voluntary. All the appropriate lines were filled in, all the clauses that protected her financial independence, her family's position, her legal standing. Everything Priya had negotiated into the original contract was preserved and extended in the dissolution. His signature line was blank. She stood at the desk and held the papers and looked at his unsigned name for a long moment. Then she put the papers back in the envelope and went to find him. He was not in the West Wing. He was not in the library or the kitchen or the East Garden. She found him eventually in the north part of the property she hadn't explored before. A stretch of land behind the main outbuildings where the cultivated grounds gave way to something less managed. A slope of unmowed grass descending toward a stone wall that marked the property's boundary, and beyond it, the open land that rolled away toward the ridge. He was standing at the wall with his back to her and his coat on, and he turned when he heard her coming because he was Lucian Moretti, and he always knew when someone was approaching. And when he saw the envelope in her hand, his expression arranged itself into the careful neutrality of someone who has prepared for a moment and is now in it. She walked up to the wall and stood beside him. Below them, the land fell away in the particular amber of late October. Dried grass and old stone and the skeleton shapes of trees that had already given up their leaves. The ridge was visible from here, the full sweep of it, dark against a sky that was doing something complicated with clouds and late afternoon light. She held up the envelope. "Your signature is missing," she said. "I know." His voice was even. "I decided to leave that part to you." She looked at the envelope. She looked at the slope of land below the wall. She thought about 28 days, about gravel in her palms and a mattress moved 6 feet, and a crow on a dry fountain, and a man bleeding on his knees in a gravel road because he'd stood up from behind a blown loading door and run across open ground to a building where she was alone with a man who'd been planning to take everything. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet, thinking quiet. "Because you signed the first contract to save your family," he said. "You were never given a version of this that was actually yours." A pause. "I didn't want to. Determine the ending of something that you never got to determine the beginning of." She looked at him. At the profile, the set jaw, the particular quality of his stillness that she had spent 28 days learning was not coldness, but control. The management of a man who felt things at a significant depth and had spent a long time building structures around that so nobody fell in. "I told you in the hospital," she said. "The debt was cleared 3 months before my father died." "Yes." "You cleared it because of Nina, not as a business arrangement, not as leverage." "Yes." "And then when the situation with Cassian developed," she stopped, "organized it. You needed someone you could control the variables around, someone you could keep close enough to protect, someone whose connection to your organization gave you a reason to have them inside the house, without explaining the real reason to the people inside the house who might be feeding information out." She held his gaze. "The contract was a cover story." He met her eyes. "A cover story I thought you'd agreed to." "I did agree to it." "You agreed to a transaction," he said. "You had no information about the real situation." "No," she said. "But I had information about you." She turned back to the view. "I'm an engineer, Lucian. I look at how things are built. I look at what's load-bearing and what's decorative. And in 28 days in your house, I watched you, the way you ran things, the way your people talked to you, the way you made decisions under pressure, and the things you protected when you had to choose what to protect." She paused. "A man is the sum of what he does when the choice is genuinely costly. I watched you make 3 genuinely costly choices, and in each one you chose the same direction." He was quiet. "You could have let Daniel stay wherever Cassian put him," she said. "It would have been safer operationally, more controlled. Instead, you mobilized 4 teams in the middle of the night." She paused. "You could have kept the drive when I found it, made the decision about where it went without consulting me. It was in your interest, arguably, to control that transmission." A pause. "Instead, you said all right and meant it." "Those weren't sacrifices," he said. "They were correct." "Yes." She looked at him. "That's what I mean." The slope below the wall caught a shift in the light. A cloud moving, something opening up in the sky, and for a moment the whole landscape went amber gold, the dead grass and old stone and the ridge in the distance, and then it closed again and was just October. She took the divorce papers out of the envelope. She tore them in half. Not dramatically, not with any particular force or theater, just cleanly, with the direct practicality of a structural engineer removing a temporary support structure that had served its purpose and was no longer the thing the building needed. She let the halves fall into the grass on her side of the wall and looked at them for a moment and then looked back at the ridge. "I didn't stay because of the debt," she said. "The debt was never really the reason." She felt him go still beside her, a quality of stillness different from his usual kind, something more raw and less managed. "I stayed because somewhere in 28 days of broken windows and cold mornings and a man on his knees in gravel." She stopped, said it plainly. "You stopped being a variable I was managing and started being the reason I wanted to solve the problem." He turned to look at her. His face, in the late October light, without the management and without the performance, and with the careful architecture of his control set down for the moment, was something she had not seen before in its full form. The face of a man who had been keeping something at arm's length for a long time and had just run out of arm. "I have significant structural problems," he said, "as a person." "I know." She held his gaze. "So do I. My life doesn't simplify." He paused. "Even with Cassian removed, the organization is going legitimate," she said. "You told me in the hospital that you'd already been thinking about it. The security and logistics framework, the businesses that were already clean. You said it was—" She paused. "Possible." "I said it was a consideration. For a man like you, that's the same thing." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm telling you that the person you actually are, the one I watched for 28 days, is someone I can work with." A beat. "If you're interested in the project—" Something moved across his face. Not the managed stillness, not the cold fury. Something much simpler and much harder than either of those things. Something he clearly didn't have ready language for because he hadn't expected to need it. "Yes," he said, "I'm interested in the project." The organization's dissolution happened over the following 4 months, and it was neither clean nor simple. Legitimate businesses were separated from criminal infrastructure through a legal process that Priya managed with 3 additional attorneys and a forensic accountant, and the process generated more paperwork than Serena had produced in 8 years of engineering practice, and was significantly less satisfying to complete because it kept not being finished. There were regulatory complications. There were creditors whose claims had to be assessed and sorted. There were former operational personnel who needed to be transitioned out of activities that were no longer being conducted and into activities that were. Lucien was, in all of this, exactly what she'd assessed him to be. A man who, once committed to a direction, applied the same focused and methodical intelligence he'd applied to everything else in his life, with no self-pity about the cost and no romanticism about the difficulty. He worked 18-hour days for the first 2 months, and then 15-hour days when Serena pointed out that the wound in his side had not fully healed, and that running a structural transformation of an organization on inadequate sleep was not different in its core risk profile from building a bridge on inadequate concrete. He went to bed at a reasonable hour for approximately 4 days before the schedule crept back up. She let it go. She was not his keeper. She was, as she had put it at the wall, someone interested in the project. The international security and logistics company that emerged from the dissolution was not, she thought, what anyone would have predicted from the outside. It employed former soldiers with particular specialties, former intelligence analysts who had left government service for reasons that varied and were not always examined too closely, and a significant number of people who had been caught in the economic wreckage of the criminal networks that the drive's exposure had dismantled, and who had skills in no direction. Lucien knew how to give direction. That had always been true. Serena joined the company's board in an advisory capacity for structural security assessment, the evaluation of physical infrastructure vulnerabilities for private and institutional clients. It was, in the specific irony of things, not very different from what she'd been doing before. She moved out of the estate's guest suite and into the wing that had always been Lucien's, and which was large enough to be 2 separate spaces without any particular effort, because she was a structural engineer and she understood the value of sufficient clearance between load-bearing elements. She did not announce this. She simply moved her things over the course of a Saturday afternoon while Lucien was in the West Wing office on calls. He came out at 6 in the evening and found her reading in the chair by the east-facing window of what had been his sitting room, And he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her books arranged on the shelf beside her own and at the coat she'd hung on the rack by the door. He said nothing. He went and made coffee and brought her a cup and sat down across from her and picked up the file he'd been working on before the calls had pulled him away. And they sat like that for 2 hours in the comfortable, unremarkable quiet of people who have been through something together and have reached the other side of it and are still there. That was how it actually started. Not at the wall, not in the winery, not in the cold of the hospital corridor. In a sitting room on a Saturday evening with coffee and a file and the familiar silence of two people who no longer need to perform anything for each other. On a Tuesday in early March, 5 months after a marriage contract had been laid on a kitchen table in an estate that smelled of grief and financial ruin, Serena drove to the Holloway Winery alone. She'd been thinking about it for weeks. Not avoiding it, the winery had been cleared as a scene, the estate formally processed, the property returned to her mother's control as part of the settlement. She'd simply been waiting until she knew what she wanted to do when she got there. She parked on the access road and walked around to the main entrance and stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. Inside, the loading door had been repaired. The search damage had been assessed and cleared. The canvas sheets were back over the equipment, laid more carefully this time than Cassian's people had left them. The space smelled of old wood and cold air and the faint mineral residue of fermentation from decades of use. And it was quiet in the specific way that old working spaces were quiet. Not empty quiet, but stored quiet, the accumulated silence of productive years. She walked to the antique press. The housing cap had been reseated. She'd asked one of the maintenance crew to do that, to put the cap back on the screw housing without explanation, and they had, and it sat there now as it had always sat, looking exactly like part of the machine it was. She put both palms on the iron surface, cold, solid, with the satisfying density of something built to last. She looked at it for a moment, the whole machine, to the press bed, the screw, the cross-beam housing, and thought about the man who had bought it in 1994 because it was the first thing he'd been proud of, and about what he'd chosen to put inside it, and about the distance between those two facts. She didn't have a word for what her father had been. She'd been trying to find one for 5 months, and she kept arriving at the same conclusion. He wasn't one thing. He'd been a man who'd made a catastrophic choice early enough that it had become structural, load-bearing, something the whole enterprise of his life had been built on top of. He'd spent years understanding this and being too frightened to dismantle it. At the end, he'd built something true and hidden it where she would find it, and she thought that was probably as close to redemption as the architecture of his particular life allowed. She could work with that. She'd been working with imperfect structures her whole career. She took her hands off the press and looked around the room. The stone walls, the high windows letting in March light that was still thin but had something of warmth starting to gather in it, the equipment waiting under its sheets with the patient quality of things that hadn't been given up on yet. She thought about the vines on the property's rear slope that hadn't been tended in 3 years and were probably not dead, just neglected, because vines were harder to kill than they looked when they'd been properly established. She thought about what it would take to restore a functioning winery from this particular point of dereliction, the assessment work, the structural repairs, the replanting schedule, the timeline from restored vine to viable vintage. 4 years, minimum, probably 5. She thought about that, about 5 years and what it meant, and what she'd be doing during it, and who she expected to be doing it with. She took out her phone and called Lucy. He answered on the second ring. "I'm at the winery," she said. "I know." A pause. "Ren told me where you'd gone." Another pause, with the quality of a man choosing his words with care. "Are you all right?" "Yes." She looked at the press. "I want to restore it." A brief silence. The winery. The whole property, the vines, the equipment, the building, all of it. She paused. "I want to make it something that works again." She heard him breathe, a long, quiet exhalation, and then, "That's a significant project." "Yes." She held her phone and looked at the room around her, at the March light through the high windows, at the press her father had been proud of, and the walls that had held 3 generations of her family's best and worst decisions. "I was hoping to find a partner for it." The silence on the other end was not uncertain. It had the quality of a man who had already arrived at an answer and was simply experiencing the fact of it. "Yes," he said. She held the phone for a moment after he said it, in the quiet of the old building and felt the words settle. The wedding happened the following October, on a Saturday when the restored vines on the rear slope had turned the specific amber gold of their first healthy autumn since the neglect had ended. The ceremony was small. Daniel, Eleanor, Priya, Ren, and Nina, who came up from Philadelphia with a quiet, direct quality and her brother's eyes, and said to Serena afterward, in the plain, straightforward way of a woman who had learned to say what she meant, "He's different with you. I want you to know I see that." Serena said, "He's the same. I'm just standing at a different angle." Nina considered this. "Yes," she said, "I think that's right." The reception was at the winery, which was not yet fully operational, but was far enough along that the main room had been cleared and the stone walls were clean and the light came through the repaired high windows the way it always should have. Eleanor Holloway stood near the antique press for most of the evening, with a glass of wine from the one viable vintage the property had managed to produce in its partial restoration. And she looked at the machine with an expression Serena couldn't entirely read from across the room. Something between acknowledgement and the long, weathered piece of a woman who had processed what she'd needed to process and was still standing. At some point near the end of the evening, Lucian came to find her. She was outside, on the rear slope, standing in the rows of restored vines in the dark, with the lights of the winery behind her and the October sky above, and she heard him come up the slope before she saw him, the sound of his steps in the dry earth. He stopped beside her. They stood in the dark for a moment without speaking, looking at the vine rows descending toward the stone wall at the slope's base, and beyond it, the land rolling away. And beyond that, the ridge, which was just darkness now, a darker dark against the sky. "Your mother's been looking for you," he said. "She found me twice already," Serena said. "She's doing fine." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's cold." "Yes." "We could go inside." "In a minute." He stood beside her in the October cold and didn't push it, and she was grateful for that, for the particular quality of his patience, which she'd come to understand was not passive but active, a choice he made in real time to let things be what they needed to be rather than what would have been easier. She'd learned a great deal about patience in the past year. She'd had a good model. She turned to look at him. In the low light from the winery's open door, that warm, practical light spilling across the slope, she could see his face with the same clarity she'd had that first morning in her father's kitchen. The dark, still eyes, the set jaw, the particular quality of his attention when it was directed at her, which was not the managed assessment he used for everything else. She had stood in the dark of a hospital corridor and looked at those eyes, and chosen to tear a piece of paper in half, and the 5 months since that moment had confirmed, daily, in the accumulation of ordinary and extraordinary details that made up an actual life with another person, that the choice had been structurally sound. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at the vines. "Load distribution," she said, which was true in the way that a structural metaphor was also always its literal self. The corner of his mouth moved. She reached over and took his hand. Cold fingers, his and hers both, and she wrapped her fingers through his with the same directness she did everything. No performance, no hesitation, just the fact of it. "Come inside," she said. "My mother found me twice and she'll find me a third time. And the third time I'd like you to be standing next to me when she does." He looked at her hand in his. "Yes," he said. "All right." They walked back up the slope together in the dark, toward the lit door of the old building, toward the sound of people they loved occupying a space that had been grief and then evidence, and was now, incrementally and without ceremony, becoming something that simply worked. Behind them, in the rows of restored vines, the October wind moved through and found nothing broken, nothing it could take. Every debt, every one, had finally been paid in full.